All right, team, so our second video for full employment, I'm going to open with this question here. So we've just looked at the measurements of full employment, and we're being asked to use this information here to calculate our unemployment rate. So going back to my unemployment rate for a moment, I know that it's equal to unemployed divided by employed plus unemployed times 100. I also know that employed plus unemployed is equal to the labour force, so just in case the information is presented in that way. So I've got some extra information here to obviously try and trick me. Total population is irrelevant. Underemployed persons is irrelevant for this question. I need to go unemployed, which is 10, divided by employed plus unemployed. So 70 plus 10 is 80. So 10 divided by 80, and then I'm going to times that by 100 to give me a percentage. Plug that into your phones. You'll find that it's equal to C, 12.5%. So there's not too much maths, guys, but I do need you to be aware of the way that we calculate the unemployment rate and also the underutilization rate. Now, you would never need to necessarily calculate using numbers the underemployment rate, but you may need to calculate the unemployment rate, and then they tell you what the underemployment rate is, and you know that those two pieces of information need to be added together in order to calculate your underutilization rate. So I hope you're keeping up. If you need to, make sure you rewind and listen to that again. All right, and I want to just do a quick 12-month summary. We want to get a sense of what's going on. So our participation rate between March 23 and 24 hasn't really done much. It's pretty much stayed constant at mid 66%. The unemployment rate as well hasn't really done a lot in the last 12 months. It's got a few fluctuations over that time, but for the most part, it's sat still at around sort of 3.6, 3.7%. And then the one that has shown a little bit of change, although minor but still significant, is the underutilization rate. So here's one for you. If the unemployment rate is fairly consistent, yet the underutilization rate is going up, what must have been happening? Now, you know that the underutilization rate is unemployment plus underemployment. So if unemployment is relatively constant, we must be seeing an increase in the underemployment rate. That must be what's going on, because unemployment plus underemployment, this one stays the same. This one has to be going up if we're dealing with an increase in the underutilization rate. Lots of U words, okay? Make sure you've got them all categorized nicely. Now, I've put this here. It's out of date. You wouldn't be asked the question with these tables, but this is the kind of question you can expect to get in respect to this SAC, okay? So it's a chonky one. They've obviously thrown 6 marks at you. They want to find out if you're able to structure it. So we've got some graphs related to the labour market and GDP. We need to assess the extent to which the Australian government has achieved its domestic economic goals of full employment and strong and sustainable economic growth during 2017 and 2018. So you can imagine this question being asked in 2024, updated graphs, updated data, and you would need to comment on 2023 and 2024, but all the theoretical elements stay the same. So how would you structure it? Look, for me, because it's got a big fat and in it, right, we've got to talk about 2 goals. I don't see this as a 6-mark question. I see it as a 2 by 3 mark question, where for 3 marks, I need to speak to the goal of full employment, and for the other 3 marks, I need to speak to the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, which hopefully at this stage you're an expert in. So for 3 marks, I'm going to define the goal of full employment. Okay, again, it's just so important to make sure you know that definition so you can effectively set the scene. Then I'm going to identify the relevant data in the table. I'm almost going to outline the trend. So if you think of a trend question, I'm going to say, okay, well, over the past 2 years, overall, unemployment has, changed from X to Y. And that's going to tell you overall, has it gone up? Has it gone down? Has it stayed the same? And then based on that, you're then able to comment on, did we achieve the goal? Yes or no? And it's really simple. If the number in relation to full employment is equal to or near 4.5%, then we're on. We know that we're achieving it. But if it's too high or too low, you need to come in and comment on the fact, well, actually, no, it's not. It's either too high or too low. So you would do that for 3 marks, and then you would basically do the same thing again, except obviously in relation to the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So once again, we know that's a pretty chunky definition as well. Come in, analyze that trend, and then comment overall yes or no. Highly recommend you use paragraphs, 2 paragraphs, obviously, to make it simple for the examiner to understand how you're approaching this question. Okay, this is the back end of the slide. So consequences of not achieving the goal of full employment. Just like strong and sustainable economic growth, the syllabus lists specific consequences that we need to make sure we know. In this case, we've got two that are associated if unemployment is too high. So remembering unemployed people don't have a job. There's too many people that don't have a job. We need to relay that towards GDP and tax revenue. So in terms of GDP, if there are more people out of work, there is a fall in consumption spending, which is going to decrease aggregate demand. In your head, draw the graph and ask yourself what happens on the x-axis. We're going to see a decrease in real GDP growth. Okay, now that's the consequence. You could potentially keep going. I know that you know the consequences of a decrease in real GDP, but it depends on the structure of the question, and I'll show you an example in a moment. The other part the syllabus needs you to do is then obviously link it to living standards. So if I've got a decrease in real GDP, in my mind, that's a decrease in real GDP per capita. Well, that's going to suggest that my access to goods and services is falling, and I can make a really tidy link from there to material living standards. The other one here is tax revenue. So being mindful that obviously the government earns a lot of tax revenue through employment. So if unemployment is too high, then there's going to be less people earning a wage, which means the government is going to earn less in the form of personal income taxes. They will struggle on other taxes as well. So if you're not spending as much, their GST revenues are going to fall, but the biggest one that gets hit is personal income taxes. So if the government's not receiving as much taxation through personal income taxes, they're going to have less money in their budget. And again, if I link that to living standards, well, what are governments responsible for? They're responsible for providing healthcare, education. In my mind, you could potentially link that really well to non-material living standards. So if you don't have access to healthcare, or you've got limited access because less money is being spent on the healthcare sector because the government doesn't have as much money, well, then ultimately that could lead to negative health outcomes for you. And that's going to have a direct link to a decrease in your non-material living standards. There's also arguments there for material. So just thinking about the arguments that you're going to use. The other side of it is, guys, you've got one consequence that you need to know in relation to unemployment being too low, okay? Obviously in terms of inflation. So this is a bit like looking at the Nauru and saying, yeah, we want unemployment to be low, like we want as many people in jobs as possible, but there is an issue with it being too low, and this is what it is. So as employment increases, more people get jobs, disposable income levels go up, and this leads to an increase in consumption spending, and that shifts my aggregate demand curve to the right. So think about your y-axis for a moment. That's going to put increased pressure on inflation, and you know that story. You need to go through it. So producers will respond by increasing output. So increase in aggregate demand, increased output. This puts pressure on our factors of production, which causes there to be shortages of them. This puts upward pressure on prices of those factors of production. We know that the cost of production goes up, and that producers are going to pass that on to the consumer in the form of higher prices. So once again, team, keep going. If we think about material living standards, ultimately things are just more expensive. I've got less access to them. That's going to lead to a decrease in my material living standards, okay? So nice tidy argument there. Make sure you've got your head around it. Now, this came up in the previous set of slides. I asked the exact same question. The only thing I've done here is I've changed the goal to full employment. And I've done that because I want you to see I suppose the selection of questions you could be asked and the fact that you could be looking to interchange any of the goals. So this was on the 2023 exam. Simply put, let's see what the consequences are for full employment. I need to update my slide and I will do that. But basically you need to define the goal of full employment, and then basically like the last set of slides we looked at, you would get into the first consequence. So state what it is and then provide further detail, just like I've done here, okay? Yes, you could quickly whip through inflation, but go deep, show the examiner that you understand what that means. Likewise, do that again for your second consequence. And be mindful, you've got consequences related to too high or too low. This question does not pigeonhole you. It says you can talk about anything, but also just be really careful to read it. There is a chance that you could have a question that says if the unemployment rate was too high or too low, and then you do find yourself pigeonholed. So just be mindful of the language. And that's it, team. I hope that makes sense.